Welcome to the Week 3 presentation for Psychology 512, Advanced Social Psychology. My name is Michael Donaldson. Now before we get started, I would like to apologize. I did forget to shave this morning. This week we're continuing our discussion of social perception by discussing stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. We will be building on what we discussed last week. So we'll begin with a brief summary of what we learned and then move on to this week's material. The basis for self-perception is our self-concept, which is the sum total of our beliefs about our own traits and attributes. We use both introspection and social comparison to shape our self-concept, with social comparison being the more reliable of the two at accurately representing who we really are. Making a social comparison necessitates defining others, thus creating a defined person that we can compare ourselves to. These attribute judgments happen very, very quickly. The human brain has limited cognitive ability, and our brains actively seek ways to simplify processing. Essentially, we're trying our very best to not have to think about it. To that end, we have each learned some pre-developed categories for types of people and have assigned attributes to each of those categories. When we first meet someone, we assess the sum of their attributes that we're conditioned to notice and project the attributes of our internal categories onto that person. This process is called attribution theory. Making these quick judgments has both social and survival utility, helping us to avoid danger and to quickly and subconsciously adapt our behavior to the social conditions that we encounter. While this process has utility, it also causes us to make some assumptions about people with certain attributes that may not be true. We often undermine the social utility that we're trying to maximize. We recognize these systemic faults as prejudice, racism, sexism, stereotypes, and discrimination. Before we get into the content and the discussion of this week's presentation, I'd like to briefly go over what we learned from each of the various texts that we read this week. Starting with the Kassin text, we begin by defining some of the key terms. Three of the terms that I'd like to make sure that we understand going into this are stereotype, which is a belief or association that links a whole group of people with certain traits or characteristics. Prejudice, which is negative feelings towards persons because of their membership or based on their membership in a certain group. And finally, discrimination, which is behavior directed against persons because of their membership in a particular group. So we'll be using those terms throughout this presentation, so it's important that those are understood. Two other concepts that are introduced are in-groups and out-groups. In-groups being the groups that we identify with, and then out-groups being the ones that we don't identify with. Between in-groups and out-groups, there can arise conflict. Some of the causes of that conflict are relative deprivation, which is a comparison between what we don't have and what we feel and somebody else does and we feel we deserve. We'll talk about that more later on as well. Realistic conflict theory, social dominance orientation. These are other terms, the things that we'll be talking about. Stereotyping was a large theme in this particular text. I think it's an important one, and we'll be talking a little bit more about the impacts of stereotyping on individuals and how stereotypes tend to be an automatic activation. Oftentimes they come into play without us even consciously recognizing it, and even when we consciously disagree with the stereotype. And then finally, the text covers reducing how to reduce stereotyping, prejudice, and discrimination. And to summarize that, I think very succinctly would be just exposure to outgroups and making a conscious effort, I think would be the best way to summarize that. The Chadi text, we read 3 chapters. The first one was about relative deprivation, understanding discontent. So I think some of the key points from this are that the level of discontent tends to not be absolute but comparative. So it's not just that I don't have enough, it's that you have more than me that creates the discontent. There are several relative deprivation models that are posed in the text. Each one answers different limitations that some of the previous models had. I don't believe any of them were perfect, but the they helped. So, and then last, there are some power struggles that can be viewed through a relative deprivation lens, and a study done on women's contentment in the workplace and power imbalances related to that. Chapter 9 was self-categorization and social identification. So this talked about how people tended to categorize their social perceptions into discrete categories, but that social identification could have multiple dimensions. So I'm not just part of one category, I'm part of multiple categories, and they can sometimes overlap and change. And that there is empirical evidence of in-group favoritism, that we tend to favor other people that are in the groups that we associate with, but there's not as clear of an empirical connection with out-group antagonism, meaning that we don't, just because we favor our in-group doesn't necessarily mean that we act with animus towards those who are not part of our in-group. And finally, most people identify in multiple categories, and there's actually a benefit that can be gained if somebody in our in-group is also connected with an outgroup to us as an outgroup. That tangential connection can actually improve our perception of that outgroup. It can actually improve relations between them. The final chapter that we covered was chapter 10, which is social categorization theories. It talked a lot about culture and cognition. Some of the key points from that I found most interesting were that self-categorization theories define how people are categorized either into personal groups, which is like a me versus you, or in a social group, which is us versus them, depending on whether talking individuals or as part of a group. People choose the group or tend to choose the group to associate with that is most normative to that situation. Some different ways that manifests would be if there's a kind of hierarchical structure for the groups that we associate with, and whichever one is most appropriate in that situation might be the one that we would align with. Social cognitive theory offers a different perspective, and that's where it talks about the overall capacity of the brain to do cognitive work is limited. And so we have a tendency to want to, your brain has a tendency to want to do that less. And so using stereotyping and other categorization tools allows the brain to minimize its necessity for cognitive work. And so there's a functional reason why it is so difficult to overcome a stereotype or overcome other types of categorization or prejudice. And then the last point from that chapter that stood out to me was the cultural impacts and how exposure to multiple cultures and even being a part of different cultures really expands our understanding of our own culture as well as the other culture. And when we're part of multiple cultures, multiple groups, that really facilitates our understanding the complexity of the nature of our in-groups and can help increase some of the connections between groups. And then finally, we read 2 journal articles. The first one talked about from Bashir some of the negative stereotypes in influencing social change. And this is how the people who are activists for a specific type of social change, if we have a negative stereotype about that person and about that type of person, it could actually decrease our ability or our willingness to support that social change, even if we might otherwise be willing to support it. I found those results interesting. The last one had to do with music preference and social identity and self-esteem. So it discussed music preference as a form of social identity, and that there was some music preferences that did impact self-esteem, but it tended to be gendered, where the women felt music more emotionally, and therefore it had a greater impact on their self-esteem than it did for men. And those gender differences did create some challenges to the current social identity theory that would be a source for um, further study. So now let's discuss how all these topics kind of fit together and kind of meld them together. Let's begin with talking about in-groups and out-groups. So in-groups are those that we identify with, that we feel like we're a part of. And the groups that we don't feel like we're a part of are out-groups. Some of the common categories could be age, sex, race, wealth, political leanings, religious beliefs. There's any number of ways that we can divide ourselves into various groups. And context can determine which one we feel most part of. So it depends on the nature of the situation that we unconsciously place ourselves and others into those categories. And that process is called social categorization. We're putting people into groups so that we can have a stronger understanding, or at least we think we have a stronger understanding of what that person is and what they represent and what they believe and what they are very quickly, so that we can make we can judge our social reactions based on those initial perceptions, which may or may not be accurate. Now, the perception we have of outgroups, they're not always negative, but they do have a tendency to be negative. But some of the characteristics that are most important to recognize is that we tend to view outgroup with homogeneity, meaning that we see all members of an outgroup as all the same. They all think the same thing, they all are the same way, where we're more willing to view differences and recognize subtle differences and changes between people in our in-group. In more extreme examples, there can be a dehumanization of outgroups. This is predominantly, you see this in Nazi Germany was a good example. But you also see it somewhat in the Middle East even today, and the perceptions of Jews or other groups that are dehumanized. By dehumanizing them, it makes it easier to psychologically be willing to attack them and to be willing to fight against them if you don't see them as human. Next is social dominance orientation. This is basically just the desire for your in-group that you are part of to dominate over the out-group. You want to be part of the winning team. And lastly is realistic conflict theory. This is the idea that conflict arises due to competition for limited resources. And that when there's a limited number of resources, you tend to want your in-group to get those resources. And so you create a negative perception of the out-groups to facilitate that. Next, we move on to stereotypes. A stereotype is any belief or association you have about somebody that is based on their group and not them as an individual. So the stereotype content model states that stereotypes can be ranked on two axes, so warmth and competence. So basically, we can view somebody as either being, warm or cool, distant stereotype, or competent, incompetent. You could be high in both, low in both, high in one, low in the other, depending on how it's categorized. And that just creates a framework for how stereotypes generally fall. But the idea of the stereotype is anytime that we're projecting a set of standards onto a person based on the group membership and not based on their individual traits as a person. Stereotype can have a significant impact psychologically, both on people individually and then also communally. Some of the interesting things that we've learned through some of the research conducted is that stereotypes can be activated even if the person doesn't consciously believe the stereotype. So this was done through subliminal word association tests, where they would place words that were associated with the stereotype very, very quickly, so quickly you can't consciously recognize it. And then it would ask the person questions about the group that the stereotype words related to, and they found that the group was rated more negatively based on those subliminal messages that were placed in the tests, showing that the activation of the stereotype, the threshold for activation of the stereotype was even lower than the threshold for our conscious belief in the stereotype. Now, because the stereotypes are automatically activated, even for people within the stereotyped group, that makes them more difficult to overcome because they come into play in our interactions with people before we consciously recognize it and without us consciously wanting them to, even if we disbelieve it. One of the interesting studies was Bashir's article on the ironic impact of activists, negative stereotypes reduce social change influence, where if a social cause could be feminism, environmentalism, or just some other cause, if the people who advocate for that cause have a negative stereotype for me or for the listener, that person would be less likely to support that cause because of that stereotype, even if the actual principles of the cause itself aligned with that person's way of thinking. So stereotypes can have a pretty significant impact in including limiting our willingness to participate in activities or movements that we might otherwise agree with, just based on the stereotype of the people who advocate for them. So with stereotypes in place, this creates kind of the seedbed for conflict between the groups. And kind of change gears slightly and talk about a concept called relative deprivation. This is where when you compare your in-group or yourself within that in-group to an out-group, and you feel that they have something that you don't, but you feel that you deserve it, that creates conflict. And the model of relative deprivation that I felt was the most exhaustive, the most complete, stated that if we see somebody else possesses something, we want that thing, we feel we deserve that thing, we think it's feasible for us to obtain it, and we feel a lack of responsibility for our failure to possess it. So saying, hey, I want it, you have it, I want it, I deserve it, I can get it, and it's not my fault I don't have it. When all of those conditions are met, then that creates the conflict where the group that feels deprived will go after that thing, whatever it happens to be. There's a lot of complexity in social self-identification. There's too much to cover in this presentation in terms of how many different ways we can divide social self-identification, but there were a couple points that I felt were important to talk about. None of us really fit into a single group. We might have a single group that we identify with the most, but we all fit into multiple groups. And depending on the circumstance, we may identify more with one than the other. Some of the examples could be if it's just a room full of people from all walks of life, but you say, okay, we're going to divide Christians over here, Jews over here, Muslims over here. We would be more inclined to group with the Christians, regardless of what other characters that there were. If, however, it was it was all people of one gender and the opposite gender of you, and you walk in the group, then you might be more inclined to categorize yourself by that other characteristic. So there's a hierarchical, depending on the circumstance, and how you would categorize yourself. The second thing is that our perceptions might be flexible. This was, I think, an important point, is that there's some evidence to show that our stereotypes and our perceptions may not be as rigid and ingrained as it would seem, that it is possible for these stereotypes to be more malleable depending on circumstance and experience. even within specific circumstances. So while you might view a group more negatively, going back to the example of the multiple religions in the room, say you had an ingrained stereotype about people of a different race, and yet you're in this group where it's a religious gathering, and all of the people in your religious faith, so all the Christians, are all of a different race. That situation may actually impact your stereotype of the people based on that race, because they're now a significant in-group for you in that circumstance. So it can actually change the stereotype that you have about the other condition they have, race or gender or whatever it happened to be. So the malleability of stereotypes and perceptions, I think that's an area that could use more study. I think that's pretty fascinating. The final section to talk about is some of the tools that are presented in the text to deal with and to reduce the negative impacts of stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice. None of the tools presented could eliminate them because of how deeply ingrained they are and how fundamental they are to the way that the human mind is constructed. But they were able to show significant improvement in relations. Some of them are pretty simple. Intergroup contact. The more contact you have with an outgroup, the more you know them, the more you interact with them, the less likely you are to feel prejudicial towards them. Another example that was fascinating was the jigsaw classroom experiment. This is where they had people in what would have otherwise been outgroups joined together, where they're each taught a different portion of a lesson. They become the expert on that, and then they get back together in their group, and they have to teach the other members of their group the section that they're the expert on. So everybody's dependent on each other to get the information to build the whole. I thought this was kind of a good application of the superordinate goal that we learned from the Robbers Cave experiment. Increasing trust and belonging. This is finding opportunities and even creating opportunities to really interact with some of these outgroups, to build our trust, and to try to break down some of the barriers that create the us-them dichotomies. Exercising self-control. Overcoming the urge to say something that might be discriminatory, and just to recognize when we are activating or have activated some type of an implicit bias or a stereotype, and then using the control to overcome that. And then finally was just cultural change, just changing the perception of cultures and how we interact with them. There are ways to change some of those norms so that what we right now have as a boundary, a firm boundary between groups, we can kind of break some of those boundaries down, kind of blur the edges and increase the number of people and the types of people that might be involved in that in-group. Overcoming stereotypes and prejudice is a significant challenge. We often don't recognize when we are applying them to a person, group, or situation. But we have discussed a few tools that may help us to at least minimize the negative effects of our social perceptions. I'd like to leave you with 2 questions to think about. First, in Cherie's Robbers Cave experiment, 2 groups of boys were placed in a situation where they were in direct competition. What resulted could be described as a war between the 2 groups. In trying to bring harmony between the groups, the researchers used propaganda and they tried using non-competitive association, and they both failed. Ultimately, it was the introduction of a superordinate goal that brought the groups together, mended the rifts between them, and allowed them to bond as groups and end the war. Our country today is divided along several significant fault lines: race, political affiliation, socioeconomic status, etc. Are there any superordinate goals that we could pursue as a nation that might heal these factions? Please justify your answer. For the second question, I hope you won't mind me discussing one of my favorite objects. This is a copy of the King James Bible that was printed in 1815 in Boston, Massachusetts. One of the things that I love the most about this is it sits almost exactly halfway between the publication of the first edition of the King James Bible in 1611 and today, 2020. And I think of the conflict that this particular book has been through. At the start of the United States Civil War, this was already an old book. It's been through the Civil War, World War I, the atrocities of the 20th century, World War II, and the unrest and the civil rights movement, everything that we've experienced from 1815 on. That's all, this book has been through all of it. In 1 Samuel chapter 16, the prophet Samuel is commanded by God to anoint a new king to replace Saul, who had lost God's favor. When meeting with the sons of Jesse, Samuel was impressed by Eliab, Jesse's oldest son, and he wanted to anoint him king. But in verse 7, God stops him, saying, "But the Lord said unto Samuel, Look not on his countenance, or on the height of his stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord seeth not as a man seeth. For man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart." As Christians, we have a charge to see other people as God sees them. Although overcoming our implicit biases is difficult, in what ways can a biblical worldview, and ultimately the grace of Jesus Christ, help us to overcome stereotypes and prejudice? Thank you for watching. I hope this presentation was helpful, and I look forward to reading your responses to these questions. God bless.